Erev Tov again. And Shmini is a little ways away. We won't read it, of course, this Shabbat, which will be Shabbat Chol Hamoed Pesach, but the following Shabbat. And the second of Rav Shai's two essays on Shmini tackles head-on one of, I think, the most challenging in certain senses scenes, stories, and issues in the Torah. And he has a little bit of a novel take and a good reading overall of the challenges, and so I'm glad that we're sharing it together. And here we go. We've definitely seen serious treatment of the story of Nadav and Avihu and their death, both with Rav Meidan and with Dr. Aviva Zornberg. So here's Rav Shai, called Of Grief, Public and Private, Moses and Aaron Face the Unimaginable. No sooner are Aaron's sons ordained than two of them die at the terrifying hand of God. The story is terse, laconic, and profoundly disturbing. But it raises fascinating and crucially important questions about mourning and devastation, about often misguided attempts to console, and about the ways leadership roles can legitimately limit public expressions of grief and sorrow. It's a harrowing scene. We're here in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 to 2. The scene, of course, Yom HaShmini is picking up on what we finished last week's Parashah with, 7 days of inaugural ceremonies, so to speak, for the inauguration of the Mishkan. And now comes day 8, whose service is much less explicitly described in the Torah, but has a special service. And Moshe tells the people that this is the day when God's presence is going to be finally manifest amongst them, after all the hard work of collecting the materials, building the Mishkan, and dedicating it over this last week. And then, as the text itself begins, it is a harrowing scene. Now Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered alien fire, called in Hebrew Eish Zara, foreign fire, before the Lord, which the Lord had not commanded them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died before the Lord. And of course, this is juxtaposed only a few verses earlier to the fire which comes down to consume the offerings on that 8th day, which is the sort of mark of the presence of God descending to take up residence, so to speak, in the Mishkan. The text is opaque. It is not clear precisely what Aaron's sons have done to so incur the wrath of God. Although, we can refer back to 2 weeks earlier when the highly ordered structure of Vayikra that Rav Shai was arguing for, at its most rigid, would indicate not necessarily, but the highest level of maintaining the structure would indicate the most severe consequences for violating the structure even just a little bit. But he takes a step back from that and says, we don't know what they did to get God so angry. Presumably, both Moshe and Aaron are stunned. Very next verse. Then Moshe said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when God said, Bikrovai ekadesh, through those who are near to me will I be sanctified. Val penei kol ha'am ekaved, and before all the people I will be glorified. Moshe appears to be saying that God will demonstrate God's holiness through the priests, whether by their cooperation with God or, as in the present instance, by punishing them. So in other words, those who are near to me, I will be sanctified. If they do the right thing, then that demonstrates, our cooperation. And if they do the wrong thing, then, their closeness to me and then consequence for violation is the punishing. And either way, that's a sort of demonstration of God's holiness. How does Aaron respond? the Torah gives us only two words, Vayidom Aharon, meaning, according to the conventional translation, Aharon was silent. Moses instructs Aaron's cousins to remove the bodies from the sanctuary, and then instructs Aaron and his two remaining sons not to engage in usual rituals of mourning. Do not bare your heads, and do not rend your clothes, lest you die and anger strike the whole community. Moses adds one further note of instruction. Do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the Lord's anointing oil is upon you. What are we to make of Aaron's silence? What is he thinking and feeling upon learning of the death of his sons? And how are we to understand Moshe's explanation of God's actions and the instructions he gives? We sort of have 3 or 4 questions here, right? How do we understand Aaron's reaction? How do we understand Moshe's reaction, both the explanation and the instructions? Following a midrash, Rashi takes Aaron's silence as a sign of his great faith. Aaron does not utter so much as a word of protest or complaint. On this interpretation, Aaron was rewarded for his silence. In the very next passage, God addresses him exclusively without Moshe playing any role. And we know it's pretty uncommon for God to speak only to Aaron. God speaks either only to Moshe or to Moshe and Aaron together. So if God's speaking now only to Aaron, the reading of the juxtaposition of these passages is a response to Aaron's righteous response, is that God, gives him a special revelation. More expansively, Rabbi Eliezer Lippman Lichtenstein, this is my first exposure to his commentary, notes that the Torah describes Aaron's response with the word vayidom rather than vayishtok. That's maybe a more common term for silence. Although the two terms appear to be synonymous, both convey that the person kept silent. Rav Lichtenstein finds an important difference in nuance between them. Whereas vayishtok, the word not used here, suggests abstaining from speaking, weeping, groaning, or any other outward manifestation, vayidom connotes inner peace and calmness of spirit, right? So the first one is just kind of a cessation of response, and the other is much more of a sense of holistic peace. The Torah describes Aaron with this latter term, Lichtenstein argues, in order to emphasize that his heart was at peace and his spirit calm, even internally. He did not question God's ways, but accepted God's decree. According to Rav Lichtenstein, not our most recent late Rosh Yeshiva of Gush, whose Torah we are closer to, not that Rav Lichtenstein, but this Rav Lichtenstein from 150 plus years ago, about 150 years ago. According to that earlier Rav Lichtenstein, then Aaron's heroism is manifest in his serene response to the seemingly inexplicable death of his sons. Yet one wonders whether such an interpretation purchases Aaron's heroism at the cost of his humanity. 2 of his sons lie dead before him. Even if Aaron refuses to question God's ways or sees no need to do so, why total silence? Would shedding a tear or emitting a cry really have constituted a crime against God or betrayed less than perfect faith? Rabbi Yitzchak Abravanel offers a dramatically different, and to my mind, says Rav Shai, at least a much more human understanding of Aaron's silence. Aaron's heart turned to lifeless stone. Right? The domem is not just silent, but we use it to refer to an inanimate object. So it's not just that he didn't speak, but he became, deeply stilled. He did not weep and mourn like a bereaved father, nor did he accept Moshe's attempts to console him, for his soul had left him and he was speechless. In other words, Aaron's silence was a function of shock rather than piety. Aaron is presented not as a hero of faith, but simply as a human being, a father stunned into numbness by the unthinkable, the sudden, completely unexpected death of 2 of his children. He does not speak because there are no words. Okay, we'll do one next section and then pause. But what if Aaron wasn't silent at all? Bible scholar Baruch Levine suggests that there are actually two separate meanings to the biblical root Dalid Mem Mem, which is the root of Vayidom, and he was silent. The first more common meaning is to be still. And as we have seen, this is how biblical commentators have almost always understood the term Vayidom when applied to Aharon, and Aharon was silent. The second, less familiar meaning is to mourn, to moan. The two meanings are obviously incompatible, and yet fascinatingly, as in our story, because they are usually homophonous and homographic, they sound the same and they're written the same, it's often difficult to discern which one is intended. Levine argues that Leviticus 10:3 says nothing about Aharon keeping silent. On the contrary, the second meaning of Dalid Mem Mem is intended, and Aaron mourned or moaned. On Levine's interpretation, the Torah tells us that Aharon reacted in the customary manner. He moaned or wailed and was about to initiate formal mourning and lamentation for his two lost sons. The whole story, we'll do this one more paragraph and then pause. The whole story now appears in a very different and more subtle light. Aaron moans and cries out because the agony of a father upon the loss of his children is irrepressible. But Moses forbids him and his remaining sons from initiating formal rites of mourning, that is, bearing their heads, maybe it should be B-A-R-I-N-G there, bearing their heads and rending their garments. Instead, he assures them the people will mourn on their behalf. So before we get to the second half, which is Moshe's comments to Aaron and the exchange between them, this was the first time I had seen this interpretation as far as I could remember, and I have no way of evaluating, its, accuracy. It's certainly, as indicated, a much less frequent use of this term, but it is a use of this term. It resonates. Just certainly, it's hard to go against 40 years or 30 years of studying one way of reading a text, and so I'm almost like, how could it possibly be the case? Why didn't anyone tell me this before now? But it's comforting in another sense. So I'm glad whatever way to share it and welcome everybody's reactions. And again, I think it's also what Rav Shai does a beautiful job here of kind of doing is not just giving us this one, but mapping out a range of possibilities. And while he, I think, does less to support or validate, the other possibilities, gives them each the space with what their potential motivations could be. Struggles most, I guess, with that last one, the Rav Lichtenstein, extreme acceptance one, but presents us a range of possibilities. So happy to hear thoughts or reactions. Bracha, go ahead.
Yeah, back when you were back in the Liechtenstein section and you talked about an unusual occurrence of Hashem speaking to Aharon privately, whereas normally he would either speak to both of them together or just to Moshe. It occurred to me that maybe Hashem was paying a Shiva visit.
Beautiful. It's, the tricky part there, and I'm just quickly trying to go to it to see, is the content of that instruction from God. So let's find it. Here it is. I'm going to share my screen again.
Into that because I was just observing a yahrzeit today, so maybe that's why I made that connection.
Yes, and good wishes. So the content is interesting because it, and we can even separate them. The fact that this is the content doesn't preclude the possibility that the solo audience does also mean something about that sort of sense of private consolation. But the next section is God speaks to Aaron and says, don't drink intoxicant when you enter the tent of meeting, so that that you won't come to die. And that leads, of course, some commentaries to suggest a different way of reading the juxtaposition, which is that this indicates that Nadav and Avihu had been drunk And that's why God says, in following up, let me clarify something. Now, was it not known before? And if it was not known before, then how could they have been held accountable for it? And of course, that's not the simple reading of, the idea that they died because of offering a strange fire. Where was that? The very first verse, right? Offering a strange fire. Maybe it was strange because they were out of sorts when they offered it. So it's Rav Shai doesn't get into that section. He went there because Rashi makes that comment, of that juxtaposition, and it reads a little less easily, I think, given the content of the message. But I think still, to your point, Bracha, one could really separate between the content of the message and the format, which was God's private visit to Aharon, and in that sense, yes, the individual audience gives the opportunity for some kind of comfort, consolation, and togetherness. Yeah, great. Other thoughts or comments? I see Lance, go ahead.
My question is, if this is supposed to be forever, it's not. In other words, if you accept everything, the temple is destroyed in 70 after the Common Era. There's no temple today. So how can you have something that's going to last through the ages, which doesn't? And God says that. I don't get it.
What's the thing that was supposed to last through the ages?
Go back to the quote, if you will.
Sure. The biblical quote or the Rav Shai article?
Just what you had on the screen. No, the biblical.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
The idea that the prohibitions relating to the temple are being presented as chukat olam, a law for all time, and you're saying, but there wasn't a temple for all time.
Exactly. So that means that God doesn't know what God's doing? I mean, it makes no sense.
All right,
unless we don't accept this as legitimate to begin with.
I want to push you for a different interpretation. But what else could it mean? How else could it understand that the temple might be destroyed and still call it an eternal law?
Well, I think the Paschal Lamb sacrifice is internal law, and the only people who do that are non-Jews. So that's a major problem here. Because, I would suggest that if you look at the Elijah's going up to heaven alive on the chariot, at one point there, and I couldn't find it today, I was looking for it, I'm pretty sure that the reaction to Elijah's going up to heaven is silence. And I actually flipped the whole thing and say that Aaron's sons go straight to heaven, and Aaron is actually rejoicing. But that's a flip. I mean, I see Moses coming down from the mountain, seeing the golden calf, everybody dancing around, thinking, oh my God, this is great. We have, idolatry. Who cares? I mean, it's all one. It's all one religion. All my house prayer for all peoples. So the point is, we don't know how this was accepted by the original audience.
Yes.
And so it opens up virtually unlimited speculation.
Yes.
It's great. I mean, it's interesting and it's fun, but what are we really accomplishing here?
Yeah, with that, I totally agree about unlimited speculation. I agree. And I guess what I would say about the, and then we'll come to Miriam, what I would say about the eternal decree may not be a satisfying answer, but I always understood it to be sort of speaking to the people in that time, rather than God saying, until the temple is destroyed or until the tabernacle no longer stands. God says this is the law forever. And it doesn't preclude God knowing that there would come a time when it would be an inapplicable law because there would be no tabernacle or temple. That wasn't God's concern at that moment. God's concern at that moment was just saying this law obtains for all intents and purposes forever. And then history intervenes how it intervenes. But as long as that tabernacle or temple stood, that was the law. But I think it's an interesting question. Could it have been articulated a different way? I think it's
Well,
interesting.
the key word there is olam, right? And it seems to me in Psalms 93 and 23, you don't have olam. You have you have different words.
Like orach yamim or something like that.
Orachimim, that's it. Yeah, orachimim.
Right.
And I think they only appear in Proverbs 3:2, Psalm 93, Psalm 23, and the Pidyon Ben.
Ooh, fascinating.
Yeah, crazy.
Awesome.
But I love that. Those are things that fascinate me and I hang on to. But the question is, what does it mean? And for me, as a Shakespeare scholar, for example, I would suggest different authors.
Sure.
And behind that, I'm not suggesting that God didn't write these things. I'm saying that God is the author of authors, and he does this intentionally. Why, I have no idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean. See, I think that most critics would suggest that if you either God wrote everything or Moses wrote everything, or you have this documentary hypothesis and you got millions of authors or whatever, but behind that are enabling, just like God enables Bezalel and God enables Joseph. So God enables, whoever wrote this to write it.
Okay. Thank you.
Rav Stephen.
Yes.
In Baruch Levine, on his comment on that sentence, he writes, Aaron's silence. Aaron accepted God's harsh judgment and did not cry out or complain at his painful loss. That's all he writes in his commentary. Maybe he wrote it someplace else, elaborated on more. But
yes,
I'm looking at his comment now.
Yes, you're looking like in the JPS Bible commentary,
right? Which he wrote.
So here in the footnote that Rav Shai quotes, you can see he has an article called "Silence, Sound, and the Phenomenology of Mourning in Biblical Israel," and that's where he develops. Okay. In fact, exactly, Ira, excellent. Thank you for the bibliographic homework here. You can see Rav Shai notes this, or that article was published. I don't see if he says here when it was published, but then he notes at the end of this footnote, in his earlier 1989 commentary on Leviticus, Levine had accepted the traditional translation, explaining, just as you quoted, that Aaron accepted God's harsh judgment and did not cry out or complain at his painful loss. So it's fascinating to see he was satisfied with that at the time, and then somehow this came to him, or he wrote it because that was all he could come up with at that time, but he continued searching and found this. So great.
I'll have to find that article.
Yes, I have no doubt you will. And I look forward to getting a copy of it from you, Iris. So thank you in advance.
Well, Stephen, I don't understand the use
Hold on, Lance. Hold on. Miriam's been waiting. Just hang on tight.
Yes, I wanted to say a number of things. One, if you accept that their deaths, the sons' deaths, are a kind of appropriate retribution for Aaron's involvement and laying the blame elsewhere with the golden calf, it comes a little bit more into focus. And it also, the whole scene flips around the characterization, or the character actually, and Moses becomes thick and stony and lacking understanding, and Aaron comes forward to say, how can you ask this of me? How can you, I'm elaborating here and so on, but he comes from a higher moral position when he justifies himself to Moshe, who only has eyes for the ceremony and for God's will, and the show must go on kind of thing. And he really shows little sympathy at first anyway to Aaron's feelings. And he is reproved when God says, when God approves of what Aaron is saying ultimately.
Are you, Miriam, just to clarify, in that last description you were giving, that was about this story? Can you say again the relationship to the golden calf?
Retribution is delayed, but it's there. I don't know why no one sees, or at the time, or whatever the story goes, no one attributes the reason for their death, which they say is strange fire, to the strange fire that brought about the structure of the golden calf and the smelting process. So I see this may be a connection, but certainly God does punish, maybe not right away, but it's to be expected.
Interesting. I feel like I have seen that suggested somewhere, but I don't remember where.
Okay, but my major point is that the positions of respect, dignity, character, moral fiber are reversed in this particular intimate arrangement between connection between Moshe and Aharon.
In the sense, just making sure I understand, in the sense that in the story of the golden calf, Moshe is sort of right, and Aharon kind of is like attempting to appease or something like that, explain, but doesn't hold this sort of strong moral ground in giving in, and in, whereas in this story now, and so Aharon is punished as a result, but then ironically, in that punishment, he is then able, in the moment of the punishment, he is able to then sort of take that moral strength, and Moshe's capacity kind of falls away. Am I understanding right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, fascinating. And I see James chatted in, yes, that God mentions punishing children for the sins of the father in the aftermath of the golden calf, right? So there's a striking kind of possible link there as well. Okay, great. Lance, would you hold on? I want to read the second half, and then I'll come back to you for comments and more. Great. So hold on a second. Switch back there. Here we go. Okay. So that's part one, Aharon's response and the different takes. And now, how are we to understand Moses's conduct? Faced with the sudden, shocking, and seemingly inexplicable death of Aharon's two sons, Moshe is at a loss. He turns to his elder brother and offers a theological explanation. Through those who are near to me, I will show myself holy, and before all the people I will be glorified. Aaron's response is extremely telling. He goes right on mourning. It's easy to imagine oneself in Moshe's shoes. Faced with the horror of sudden death, confronted by the anxiety that everything he has built will now crumble, haunted by an internal voice that cannot help but wonder why God would do this, Moshe responds by reaffirming a theological truth he believes can help him and Aharon make sense of this unendurable turn of events. But Aaron will have none of it. Implicitly, he reminds Moshe and us that there are moments when theological explanations, whether compelling on their own terms or not, simply have no place. When a father stares into the abyss and sees two of his children lying dead before him, the first response is not theology, but grief. Moses may need to assure himself that his world has not fully fallen apart, but in sharing his explanation of Nadav and Avihu's death, he fails to make adequate space for Aharon's utter devastation. So Aharon rightly ignores Moshe's words. Emotionally, at least, his moaning is far wiser than Moshe's speech. Especially when death is untimely or sudden or traumatic, people often visit Shiva homes and end up, usually unconsciously, trying to assuage their own anxieties instead of comforting or just sitting with the mourners. Halakha tries to preclude that by instituting silence as the mode we embrace when we enter a house of mourning. We speak when spoken to. We do not impose our own theological musings on people who are beset with grief. The Talmudic sage Rav Papa declares, the merit of attending a house of mourning lies in the silence observed. The book of Iyov poignantly describes Iyov's friends' initial reaction to his grief. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. None spoke a word to him, for they saw how very great was his suffering. Accordingly, Rabbi Yochanan teaches that comforters are not permitted to say a word until the mourners open conversation. I think, just pausing to say this, I think this is such a beautiful paragraph. It's so astute and correct, both in its charitable recognition and understanding of why people say all the things that they say, and it's wise and beautiful in its recognition of the ways in which the halacha is attuned to that and attempts to guide us, give us the best frameworks to try to free ourselves from those, again, self-comforting temptations, which are so rarely comforting and so often less good than comforting. I think it's just a very powerfully written section. But Moshe does not wait for Aaron to speak first. Instead, as we have seen, he imposes a theological interpretation on the shocking turn of events long before it is time. How can we understand Moses' seemingly unfeeling response? Aaron and his sons have just been ordained, and God's presence has appeared at the newly consecrated Mishkan, the tabernacle. The founding and establishment of the divine service appears to be going according to plan. But then in the very next verse, even before the sacrifices have been eaten, everything seems to fall apart. Nadav and Avihu behave inappropriately, with grave and terrifying consequences. For Moshe, it must feel like deja vu. A tremendous amount is at stake in this moment, both for Moshe and for the people of Israel. At Mount Sinai, God and Israel had pledged their commitment to one another. But as soon as Moshe tarried on the mountain, the people had turned to idolatry. Moshe was enraged and distraught. Here now, the next stage of Israel's life with God is about to begin. And again, things go badly awry. Moshe's and God's plans are disrupted, just as they are being actualized. Order is again undermined by chaos. And this time, the violation may well be unclear even to Moshe, making for a doubly terrifying scene. It is easy to condemn people who speak in haste. It is usually far harder to understand them. So that's all he says, I think, in this sense, which is the, I don't know if it would say cutting a little slack, just trying to feel our way into what this felt like for Moshe uniquely, differently than it would have felt for anybody else, as the person who sees himself as bearing responsibility for maintaining order, structure, bringing the next stages about in the relationship between God and Israel, and he's, in addition to the loss that he's experiencing in a family level, he sees the potential unraveling of everything. And so I think, Shai, again, he ends like kind of equivocating in a sense, not letting him off the hook, not saying it was the fine thing to say, but just saying we got to at least understand where he's coming from. But what of Moshe's prohibiting Aaron and his sons from mourning publicly? Why can't the family grieve as they choose? As priests, Aaron and his sons are entrusted with the work of affirming and preserving life. By virtue of their consecration, the priests and their vestments belong to the sacred sphere that was to be dissociated from death and corpse contamination. Under normal circumstances, Aaron's 2 remaining sons would have been permitted to participate in burying and mourning their brothers. But here, as disaster seems poised to undo the very founding of the Mishkan service, they are held to the strict standard of holiness, normally associated exclusively with the high priest, meaning of not contaminating themselves by coming in contact with the dead, even for a family member. It may be tempting to condemn Moses' instructions, but I wonder whether that reflects, in part, just how secularized our society has become. We would all likely agree that circumstances may sometimes require public leaders to delay or suspend their mourning. If America's security were in grave peril, we would expect the president to do what was needed to attend to the situation at hand, even if delaying his or her mourning exacted a psychological toll. And that is what this situation is like. Moshe is frightened and uncertain about Israel's future, the very heart of its life, the reason for its being, its covenant with God, may be in grave danger. So Moshe expects the priests to put that reality first. As biblical scholar Roy Gain puts it, Moshe's intense reaction reflects the severity of the situation. I've distinguished between Moshe's attempt to explain Aaron's tragedy, which, though understandable, is problematic, and his dispensing orders for managing the crisis, which is his responsibility as Israel's leader, and all the more so in times of crisis. The lessons here are subtle. The impulse to explain other people's tragedies often stems from our own fear of chaos. It is almost always crucial to resist the urge to share those explanations with them. But sometimes people find themselves in positions of great responsibility. Part of what those roles entails is that we cannot always give free and unhindered public expression to our grief. So that's his part 2, reflections on Moshe's theological answer, and then, legal instructions. All right, I see Lance, and then happy to hear from others. Go ahead, Lance.
Okay, number one, there are 2 golden calves, and I think that's the heart, the crux of the problem that I have, and maybe it's just me because I have suffered from tangentiality, which means I don't think logically, I think laterally. If you begin to make the assumption that there are 2 golden calves, then one is the omniscient narrator says that things went awry and Aaron put together calf and blah blah blah. But the other is, if you think of the first person testimony of Aaron, then the golden calf emerges from the flames in a hierophany. I mean, same as the burning bush. Number 2, the word phenomenology was kicked around there, and phenomenology it's a hot button, really. There's so many different ways, so many different people talking about phenomenology, but some of the ideas are that we're embedded in the world. Human perception is part of the world. There's no inside the brain and pictures outside. We have a pre-reflective cogito. Descartes' cogito is consciousness, but the pre-reflective cogito is some kind of extrasensory perception. Also, I just want to point out, maybe it's just me, but you mentioned Shiva, and suddenly there was Shiva in the text. For me, that's a connection. In Torah.com, that's Rabbi Farber, am I correct? He's
Among others, yeah, one of the lead editors.
Right. Israel Cohen, I'm probably getting his name right. Anyway, talks about priesthood religion versus holiness religion. And I think that means a difference between what I call the Kahanic religion and the rabbinic religion. And I think that there's a tremendous conflict there. And I think that most of the time, in my experience, rabbinic Judaism tends to really virtually want to destroy the Kahanic religion. An good example, is the Ethiopian Kesach, which the rabbinic authorities in Israel have destroyed, have exterminated, despite the fact that the Ethiopians don't really want that. They are Kahanic. The Kesach did the Paschal Lamb, okay? First, then you have the Samaritans. The Samaritans are Kahanic. They do the Paschal Lamb. Then you have the Igbo, the Nigerian Igbo, they are Kahanic. And unless you accept the Talmud, then, you're not a Jew. Karaites are not Jews. I mean, to me, it doesn't bother anybody else. It's just me, because I'm a Cohen. Sorry. I have other things, but I think I'm going to stop right there.
Great. Many thoughts, and always more to continue to digest and take in. So thank you.
Stephen, I just sent you the Levine article.
Thank you.
And you may want to share it with me. It's very interesting to read.
Great. I'll send it around, hopefully before Pesach to the group, so we can digest it. We have plenty of time to think it through before Parashat Shmini.
Right, you got a few Shabbatot.
Yes. All right, David L. and then James.
I don't have any opinion about the Kahanic religions, but I do have maybe an opinion about Moshe.
Great.
And I think that, do you think that the fact that Moshe is basically raised outside of the context of family influences the way that he responds here? Question number 2. I'm surprised a little bit by what Rav Shai talks about here, which seems to suggest that it's impossible to respond theologically to certain moments. Whether it's right to share that response is a totally different question. I'm sorry, I lost a specific reference where he said it.
Yeah, I'm looking for it also. Yeah, here it's on the top of page 34. I can share it on my screen. Implicitly, he reminds Moses, 4th line, and us that there are moments when theological explanations, whether compelling on their own terms or not, simply have no place.
Right. And then he goes on to say, when a father stares into the abyss and sees 2 of his children lying dead before him, the first response is not theology, but grief.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that, there's a whole lot of ways to slice and dice this. And is the reason that there are moments when theological explanations, whether compelling or on their own terms, simply have no place. He doesn't say that we are not able to have theological responses. And I don't really know what he means. What do you think he means?
Okay, great. You asked me 2 questions.
Yeah.
On the family one, it's interesting. It seems like, I'll start here. It seems like, I don't know, from whatever little data we have, maybe not so little, it seems like Moshe and Aaron have a decent relationship. But I think you're not asking that as much as you're asking, Moshe has a complicated relationship with his own family, his own children. So is there a way in which, and Moshe was raised outside of the home of his own parents. So are there ways in which those poorly formed attachments impact his way of reacting? It's so interesting because God, the Midrashic tradition, and I think it's borne out in the text that he was chosen because of his tremendous compassion for every sheep of the flock. If I'm trying to put all those pieces together, I do feel like it potentially paints a picture of somebody who's able to arouse more empathy for the less close to them, for whom they have responsibility, and less empathy for the ostensibly inner family, especially when that intersects with their other professional duties. So while I wasn't thinking in that direction, I think that they're definitely, a character sketch of Moshe could include an analysis that, would make us not feel so surprised that he wasn't also, having a Vayidom response. So that's the first set of thoughts on that question.
Well, before you go to question number 2, I just to focus the first question a little bit more. Moshe has relationships with women. And in fact, when Miriam has tzara'at, Moshe steps up and asks God to heal her. Right? But when Aaron does or doesn't do whatever he was supposed to do at the Egel, there's not the same sort of, I've got your back forgivingness. You might even say that Moshe has a transactional relationship with Aaron, that they're doing a job and they suck it up suggestion after the death of Nadav and Avihu may be totally consistent with who Moshe is as a person. The one man that he seems to have had a positive relationship with was Yitro.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm probably giving overly significant weight to God telling Moshe, and I guess probably Exodus chapter 3 or 4, when you go down to Mitzrayim and you meet Aaron, that he's going to be joyful to see you. I always thought that was like a good sign, a good start. But when the relationship actually plays out, we don't see necessarily conflict, but transactional. We don't necessarily have that much data to prove that it's more than that, even though that's absence of proof is not proof of absence. So, but I think you definitely added more color in the second round of comments, and yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Rav Stephen, a few weeks ago, you said it's unusual that we're dealing with a living author now, and we can ask him questions. So why don't we gather the questions from a few of these weeks and ask him to join us in a Zoom and let him respond to these questions? It could be fascinating.
I'm not close to the idea.
Okay.
I've jotted it down.
It isn't.
Hold on, Miriam. Hold on 1 second. I want to try to come back to David's comment and to James, and then I'll come back to you. And I see Bracha has a hand also. Yes. So to the point, the question about what exactly does it mean? Theological explanations, whether compelling on their own terms or not, simply have no place. Yeah, because no place doesn't just mean, don't say them to one person or a different person. It means sort of like this is, like a void, an empty space vis-a-vis theological explanations. Yeah, I mean, it does resonate with me. And I guess the question then is, maybe my follow-up question is, why, if one accepts that premise, why would it be the case that with the passage of time, a theological explanation would then become appropriate for the same event? Right? I could understand saying, you have your explanation, but now is not the right time to say it. But even with that, right? If it is that you have your explanation, but now is not the right time to say it, then is later a right time to say it? Yeah.
I thought you had your finger on it. The words "no place" is very broad, and it doesn't just mean that it's not good manners to share your thoughts about somebody else's grief. And what I, in thinking about it, was just musing and saying, you know what? So this is beyond our ken. This is beyond what we're capable of understanding. But then if you step back and say, well, what are we capable of understanding about the omniscient, omnipotent one?
Yeah. Great thoughts. And it is interesting. Some people have kind of posited about the notion of aninut specifically, the exemption from positive commandments and really practiced as kind of the non-observance of positive commandments, kind of like affirmative relationship of connection with God in the immediate aftermath of the death of a loved one. That's there's the practical explanation because a complete focus on arrangements for burial and dignified treatment of the deceased is supersedes all, and so you're freed from everything to do that. And the accompanying theological explanation is the rabbis understood, or the Bible understood, or God was expressing that there are times when there's nothing. It's unfair to expect. It's unreasonable to expect. It's inappropriate to assume an affirmative connection with God. I always felt like that probably is really helpful for some people, but not for others, right? In the same as it in fact plays out. Some people say to me, fine, I'm exempt from, davening, but what if I want to go to shul tomorrow morning? Like I'll make the arrangements or I'll take a break. It would be comforting for me to go join up for Shacharis. So, yeah, just another thought to add to this question of theological explanation and theological connection. It's one of the big questions and bears more thought. So thank you. Tati James?
I was thinking there could be an easier explanation that Aaron was looking to Moshe to explain what happened. I mean, if it was confusing to us what happened, it might be confusing to Aaron. And Moshe, who had been orchestrating the whole ritual thus far, Aaron might have looked to him, maybe with just an expression for an explanation of what just happened or a reason. And Moshe gave, an inarticulate one, but that's what prompted Moshe to speak.
Right.
He's the prophet. He has the connection to God. So if you have a question of like, why did God do this? So you would ask Moshe, why did God do that?
Right. Aaron has no recorded initial reaction because he's sort of waiting for something in this moment. Moshe says what he says, and Aaron is silent further either, and then we can go into why is that silence. Yeah, I mean, I think at one level, again, in the framework of, they're in their professional, leadership roles, and Moshe has that position, right? But then at a different level, Aaron should have felt, this is not a critique of him, but we would expect Aaron to have just reacted instinctively in some way, but no, also maybe not. I mean, we have the, the shock possibility, or, I think it can fit in with some of the existing interpretations or sort of on its own. I hear it. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I guess the more I think about it, I'm trying to picture the scene. And it's hard.
I guess I'm pushing back that it's often portrayed that Moshe is like this bumbling fool that he just puts his foot in his mouth. But I think he has a place both professionally and personally to try to explain what happened as the prophet, as the person orchestrating the ritual.
Right.
If even though the explanation is clumsy, it's his job to try to do it.
Right. So you're sort of saying almost like the explanation that Rav Shai gives for the follow-up halachic instructions is also somewhat relevant for the theological explanation part. It's he's overseeing the whole thing. It's sort of under his auspices. He is the leader. And so, he's not just like any other person coming to a shiva house who's supposed to sit and be quiet. He's an actor alongside in this moment. And so he has more license or responsibility in that sense. Yeah, right. I mean, maybe in that sense, the response of Vayidom Moshe, could have played in here in a certain way, even almost like after the first response or something like that. But yeah, no, I hear that. Sort of looking to him for something, and he does what he does, and then it sort of unfolds from there. Yeah, great. Bracha, go ahead.
Yeah, going to the point raised earlier, which was very interesting about Moshe not having good connections with males. And thinking about his early upbringing was very strongly influenced by strong females in terms of Paro's daughter who rescued him, and Miriam who watched over him very carefully to protect him. So I'm thinking of that, and then I'm also thinking of where he did have a close connection, and that was with Hashem, who in those days, I'm sure, was more regarded as male than male and female. But maybe it was easier for him to have that connection because Hashem is distanced to begin with.
Oh, really interesting. Interesting. Thank you. All right. I think Lance is up for a last word. And then
Okay. What is the difference between Nadav and Abihu doing something that God doesn't want to do and getting punished, and Moses doing something that God doesn't want to do and never gets to the promised land? It seems to me they're exactly the same situation.
Yeah, I think they're similar in the sense of we have complicated feelings about both, and in each case there's a strong feeling that the punishment is severe for the crime, and in fact in each case, even while the Torah ostensibly seems to explain the crime, in the case of hitting the rock, there it's clear that that's not necessarily the whole story. So Moshe himself is not immune to the experience of having a very harsh punishment for doesn't seem such a harsh crime or excusable on some plane. So I think that's true. We won't get to see Rav Shai's take on that, but I'll be curious to see, or we can see if in his essays on Bamidbar he tackles that question. So that we could easily access. All right, I will send around the article that Ira sent from Professor Baruch Levine on this different reading of the Ruth Daled Mem Mem, and take the opportunity to thank everybody, wish everybody a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. We will be off next Monday as it's Chol HaMoed and still Parashat Shmini, and then we'll resume the following. So we'll see everybody in 2 weeks, if not before. And if you need anything Pesach related, don't hesitate to be in touch. And love to mom and dad, and good night to all.
Are you going to use Google to search for comments?
What's that?
You're using Google to search for comments.
Well said. On that note,
Rav Stephen,
yes.
The end time for services on Wednesday night.
Wednesday night. We are going to say a quick Hallel. So I would think, let's see, what time we call to begin.
7:17.
Yeah, I think the goal is around 8. We want to get people home as close to Seder start time as possible. So
8. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Night.
Okay.
Night all.
Bye.
Wow.